Hi, I'm Adam. Welcome back to Godot Game Lab. In this video, we'll create the card pile view so the player can view their deck, their draw pile, or their discard pile at any given time in the game. You can see that I started a new run here with the warrior, and we have this bar at the top of the screen. We have this button here which indicates that our deck has 10 cards currently. And if I click on it, it opens up this card pile view here, which has a scroll container if we have more cards than we can display. And I can hover over those cards and click on them to see what they do. I can click on the card again, or I can press escape to close this, click on this back button, or press escape again to click this card pile view. And if we start a battle, you can see that we still have our deck and the top bar here, but we also have two new buttons at the battle UI. This one is the draw pile, and I see in a randomized order what cards I will draw next and how many cards are there, and you can see that my discard pile is empty. So if I play some cards, you can see that they get added to my discard pile, and if I click on it, you can see them in order. If I end my turn here, two more cards get added to my discard pile, and I draw some new cards next turn. You can see that we have two cards left here, and we can play all those cards just like we did before. Before we jump into the implementation part, let's take a step back and talk about the architecture for a second. In my How Do I Design Architecture for My Games in Godot video, I talked about a pretty useful framework I used to think about game architecture. So first of all, let's think about it from a data perspective. We really need to answer two questions: what data we produce and what data we need. For the card pile view itself, we don't produce any data, which makes our life a lot easier because it means that this card pile view is pretty self-contained, right? It doesn't really influence any other system in the game. However, we do need data, namely a card pile resource, so we know what cards we need to display. The other important thing to think about here is the communication between the different systems, or in this case, the use cases for our card pile view. So where do we use this card pile view in the game? Two places really. We use it in the battle and we'll use it in the run. For the battle, we need to access the discard and the draw piles, and in the run level, we need to access our current deck. So in practice, what we do is we take the battle scene, we inject that card pile dependency to those card pile views and provide one for the discard pile and one for the draw pile. And in the run level, what we need to do is we need to create a card pile view under the run, and again we inject that card pile dependency from the run to the card pile view, in this case for viewing the deck. And it's pretty simple, that's all the architecture we need for the card pile view, so let's get started with the implementation next. So you can see that I have my project open here, and the first thing we want to do is we want to create a new CardMenuUI scene. Why do we need this? Why can't we just use the CardUI scene we already have? So if I open this scene we already have with Ctrl-Shift-O and search for CardUI, you can see that we already kind of have this, right? And it has the panel, it has the cost and the icon, which is pretty good, but it also has some functionality we actually don't need when we're navigating the menus, right? We don't really need the card state machine to interact with the card. And we also don't need this area to this drop point detector. And the script itself is not really what we want at all, because this is all gameplay related stuff, right? So what we need to do is we actually need to create a separate scene, which I will call CardMenuUI, which behaves quite a bit differently from this CardUI scene we have. So how does this CardMenuUI scene will work? It's still going to be interactive, like the CardUI, but in a different way. If you think about what we can do with this CardMenuUI is we can hover over the card, and if we click on it, we want to display a tooltip what the card does. Because oftentimes in the menus, we don't have the space to display this pop-up tooltip we have in the battle scene, right? Okay, so we established that we need a different scene for the CardMenuUI. But that doesn't mean that we can't use stuff we already have and configured for the CardUI, right? So why don't we go ahead and select this CardUI scene here and go to Scene, Save Scene As, and if we go back one folder, we can save this CardMenuUI under our UI folder here, rename this to CardMenuUI and save this scene. You can see that we have this CardMenuUI now here. And we can delete all the stuff we don't need. So select this drop point detector and shift click card aiming state to select all of these nodes, press delete and hit OK. Cool. So now we have all this stuff here and we can double click and rename this to CardMenuUI. We can also detach the script we have because we'll have a new script here. And if we go to node and signals, you can see that we have these 3 signals here and we can disconnect those because we need to reconnect them when we provide the new script. And we also need to create a new child node here, which will be a center container. And actually this center container needs to be the parent and we can rename this to something else. So double click this. I press Ctrl X to cut this name and rename this to visuals. Double click the center container and press Ctrl V to paste this name we cut previously. And to make this the parent node, all we need to do is right click this node and click on Make Scene Root. So now we have this hierarchy. So why do we need this single control node and why do we make the root a center container here? Let me explain. The reason why we need a center container here is because we'll use a grid container later on to populate this card pile. And to make sure that everything looks tidy and centered, what we do is we check the field property of all those CardMenuUI items. And what it does is it tries to fill all the horizontal space available, right? So you can see that if we have 6 CardMenuUIs here, and if they fill their space, we'll make sure that they are equally distributed along the horizontal axis. And by using a center container for this, we can make sure that all of the center container's children are aligned to the center both horizontally and vertically. And we'll use a control node to display everything else in that card and set those sizes exactly to 25 and 30 pixels. And we'll make sure that we only connect the interactive signals like the on-mouse entered, the left-click GUI input, and the on-mouse exited signals to this control node, the visuals, right? Because we don't want to hover over here and display this hover border. We only want to be able to click on the card itself. Hope that makes sense. Okay, but we still need to make some slight adjustments here. First of all, select the visuals node we have, this control node, and go to the inspector panel and check if we still have this custom minimum size set to this value, which we do. And also see if our mouse filter is set to stop, which it is. Cool. So that's all we need here for now, but we need to connect those signals later to handle interactivity. But for that, we need the script attached, which we don't have yet. So let's go to this center container here, to the inspector panel. And one thing we can do is we can set its transform, reset the size. So it will be 25 by 30 also. And it looks the same, but what we need to also do is go to container sizing and set its horizontal property to expand. So what it does is it fills all the horizontal space in its parent container. And also because it's a center container, it will center all of its content, right? So this visuals node here we have will always be 25 by 30, and it will be centered both horizontally and vertically in the center container, no matter what size it is. And that's perfect for us. So that's all the visual setup we need. Let's press Ctrl S to save this. And we can create the code for this as well by selecting the root node here, clicking attach script. And CardMenuUI.gd is perfectly fine, and we don't need any sort of auto-generated code. So under template, we can select object empty, press create, and let's not forget to connect the signals we need before starting to code to avoid typos. So click on visuals, go to node, and connect the mouse entered signal by double clicking on it and pressing connect. Double click the mouse exited signal, connect, and also the GUI input event. So double click this and connect it as well. So how does the code look like here? First of all, we'll create a new class name so we can get auto completion whenever we reference this class. Then we'll define a new local signal, not a signal in the event bus, called tooltipRequested, which we can emit whenever we click on this card. And whoever and however wants to handle showing the tooltip can do it by connecting to this signal. Then we'll have two constants for the base and the hover style boxes. And you can see that we use the same ones we defined for the CardUI scene, and that's perfectly fine. We can reuse those, right? So whenever we hover over the mouse to a CardMenuUI, we can switch to the hover style box. Also, we'll have an export variable called card, which is expecting a card resource, and it also has a setter function to change up the cost and the icon. And we also have three already variable references to our panel, so we can change the style box, and to the cost and the icon, so we can change them based on the card data we have. And in the functions, on the GUI input event callback, we'll check if the event is a left mouse click, and if it is, then we can emit this signal we have, this tooltip requested, and pressing the card data we have as a parameter. On the mouse entered callback, all we need to do is set the panel's theme override property to the hover style box, and on the contrary, in the onMouse exited callback, we'll set the panel's theme override property to the base style box. And finally, we need to define the setter function for the card property. And what we do is, first of all, we wait for the ready signal if the node is not ready. So we can test this from the editor by setting the card. And when we're ready, all we need to do is change the card's value to this new value we want to set, and update the costs text property, and also update the icon's texture to the icon we have for the particular card. And that's all there is to it for now. So we can save this with Ctrl S, and let's see if we can test it, right? Go back to 2D view, and you can see that we have this card property here. And what I've found with Godot 4.2 is we have a strange error sometimes. Let me show you what I mean. We have this new card property here in the card menu node, and if we click on this arrow and press load and go to the warrior characters cards folder, you can see that I have all my cards here. And I could use this slash right as this card property because it's a card. But if I click open or double click this, I get this error message that the selected resource does not match any type expected for this property, which is kind of weird because it's a card, right? What I found is that the drag and drop method for some reason still works. So if we go to this characters folder and expand the cards under the warrior, I can use that same file, that warrior/.tres, drag and drop it here, and it works. So I don't know, that's just a weird bug. So for now, I'll just stick to this drag and drop method because it always works. And now we can test this. So if we run the current scene or press F6, it should update the icon, and I can hover over the card and you can see that this style box changes. And the cost is 2 as well. So everything works as intended, but just to make sure, we can use a block card too here. Run the scene again, and you can see that the cost updates as well. Okay, so that's it for the CardMenuUI itself. Let's see how we can use this to build the CardPileView next. And to do so, we click on this plus sign here to add a new scene. And we'll start with a user interface, a basic control node as a root node. Double click and rename this to CardPileView. And let's zoom in a bit to see what's going on here. And add a new child node with this plus sign or by pressing Ctrl A. And first we'll add a color rect for the background. Click on the anchor preset and set it to full rect to make sure it covers the whole screen. Double click and rename it to background. And set the color property. I'll use black here, but you can use any color you want. And set it to somewhat transparent, maybe like so. And click on the CardPileView, the root node again. Add a new child node, and this time we'll use a margin container to make sure that all the content of this CardPileView has some nice margins around it, so it's not at the edge of the screen. So what we do is we set the anchor preset to full rect for this one too, and go to theme overrides, constants, and set these margin values. I'll use 10 for all of these, but you can use whatever value you like. And we'll see how this looks in a sec. So under this margin container, we add a new child node, this time a VBox container And you can see how this looks like, right? We have this little 10 pixel margin at all of those sides. And I think that looks perfect. For this VBox container, we'll have two child nodes, so add a new one. The first one will be a label to display whatever this CardPileView is. For example, we can say something like discard pile. And make sure to center this in the horizontal axis. Double click and rename this to title. And also we want to be able to access this and change it based on the data we'll have. So right click this and access it as a scene unique name. So no matter how buried this is in the hierarchy, in the node hierarchy, we can still access it. And also we can use a bigger font here, I think. So click on this label settings, new label settings, and we can use a font size of 12 pixels maybe. I feel like 16 is too big here. Yeah, that looks all right. And under the VBox container, we'll have one of the most important nodes here. Click on the plus sign and we use a scroll container. Because if your deck becomes too big or your discard or draw pile becomes too big, we need to be able to scroll them. So when we run out of space, we can still view all the cards. And we'll use a scroll container for this. You can see that we have this warning sign immediately, which says that it's intended to work with a single child control. And we don't need to worry about this. We'll add it in a second, but let's configure this scroll container itself first. So for the scroll container, we have some options here. What we want is the horizontal scroll bar to never show. So click on this auto and select never show, but we can always display the vertical one. So click on auto and select always show. So we can see how it looks like. And also, if you go to layout, you can see that this scroll container has a height of 0 right now, which is not that good for us. If we go to container sizing, we can go to vertical and select this expand property. And you see immediately what it does. We have this VBox container, which has two children, right? And the height of this VBox container is the height of the screen minus those 10 plus 10 pixels at the top and the bottom. And what this expand property does is it says that this scroll container, which is a child of another container, should fill and expand to all the available space, right? So under this scroll container, we need another container, just like the warning sign is trying to tell us. And what we'll do is we'll add a new child node here. And for the cards themselves, we'll use a grid container. And the grid container is basically a table. And we only have this columns property here. And we can say that we'll be using 6 columns, for example. And what we also need to do is to go to layout and make sure that this grid container also fills all the available space to make sure that it's at least this big, right? And we can also double click and rename this to cards or something like that. And this is also a crucial node because that's where we want to add our card menu UIs when we want to populate this card pile view. So we can also right click this and select access a scene unique name to make sure that we can access this in code wherever it lays in the node hierarchy. All that remains is to see how this looks like, right? So what we can do is we can select this cards grid container here and click on the instantiate child scene and search for CardMenuUI. And if we add one, you can see that the scroll bar is immediately displayed and we can sort of start duplicating this, right? And we have 6 and this is how they look like in a row. And we can also go back to this grid container and go to theme overrides and we can set the separation. So horizontally, I think it looks better with 0. And vertically, we can set something like 10, but to see how this looks like, we need to duplicate those CardMenuUI scenes a couple more times. So what I do here is I select all 6 of those nodes and press Ctrl D again. And again, and again. You can see that we have 24 cards here, and the scroll bar itself shows us that we could scroll now when we run this scene. And we have all those cards in this nice grid or table layout. And I think 10 for the V separation looks fine, but you can play with those values however you like. Maybe if we set it to something like 8, we can see that like 18 cards kind of perfectly fit, which might be something you want. And what else do we need to do here? We are missing a button to actually close this. Oh, and also for the VBucks container, we might want some space between the title and the cards, right? So select this VBucks container, go to theme overrides and constants, and we can do 10 pixels maybe. Yeah, I think that looks better. So we can have some space, some breathing space between the text and the cards themselves. And you can see that we no longer have this perfect row of 3 cards, but I don't think it matters that much. It looks better anyway. Okay, so that's pretty much all we need to do within this margin container, so we can collapse this. We're also missing a button, right? So we want the button to be able to close this CardPileView. And to do so, we'll select the CardPileView, the root node, click on the plus sign, search for button, add a new button here. For the text, we can use something like back. And also this 40 by 40 default size is kind of weird. So if we go to layout and transform, we can set it to something like 14 on the Y, which looks much better. And we can anchor this to the top right corner of the screen and go to move mode by pressing W and sort of move it around somewhere like this. Okay, I go back to select mode by pressing Q, and we can also rename this to back button and right click and access it as a scene unique name because we want to be able to connect this button as well from code. Okay, so that's all the basic setup we need here. Let's just save this scene by pressing Ctrl S. And under the UI folder, we can save it as CardPileView. And we did a bunch of stuff, so let's just test how this looks like in-game and how this works, right? So if we run this current scene with F6 or with this button, you can see that we have our discard pile. I can hover over the cards. Nothing happens if I click on them. They emit their signal, but we haven't connected to that signal yet. And I can also scroll with the mouse wheel up and down. I can use the scroll bar too. And click on this back button, which does nothing because we haven't connected to the pressed signal of that button yet either. Cool, but this looks okay. This is what we wanted. So we can start coding and adding all that interactivity stuff to it next. In order to add interactivity to the game, we need to display this little pop-up window when we click on a card to see what it does. And we can certainly do it here, but see, the problem is we need to reuse that stuff later on in the project. So it's always a good idea to stop for a second and ask this question: do I need to reuse this later on? If the answer is yes, then it's probably worth taking that piece of this puzzle and create a separate scene for it, so we can reuse it later, right? And that's actually what we're going to do with the pop-up, because we want to use that in the shops as well, right? When I enter a shop, we have cards and relics there, just like you saw in the demo in the first video. And when you click on those cards, you want to be able to display this tooltip. And so it makes sense not to implement it in the card pile view, but do it in a separate scene, so we can pack it up and reuse it when we want to. So it's always a good idea to stop for a second and think about this or ask this question when you work in Godot. So we'll create a separate scene for this. Click on this plus sign here, and we'll use a control node again as a root node. So click on this user interface, double click, and rename this to something like CardTooltipPopup or something like this. Zoom in a bit. And we can save this under UI as well as CardTooltipPopup.tscn. And what do we need here? We'll add a bunch of child nodes by clicking on this plus sign or pressing Ctrl A. Search for color rect. This will be our background, so we can double click and rename this to background. We can set the anchor preset to full rect to make sure it covers the whole screen. And set the color to again, I use this semi-transparent black here. Something like this. And we'll also select the root node again, click on the plus sign, and we'll add a VBucks container. And this VBucks container will have 2 children as well. One of those, click on this plus sign, and one of those will be a center container for the card itself. And we can double click and rename this to tooltip card. And if we select the VBucks container again, click on the plus sign, and we'll add a rich text label for the description. And we can double click and rename this to card description. And we set both of those. I select both of those nodes and we set them scene unique so we can access them in code. And to make sure we see what they look like, under the tooltip card, we'll instantiate with this button or by pressing Ctrl-Shift-A a CardMenuUI scene, like so. And for the card description, I enable BB code because we have BB code in our tooltips, and I just type in card description, copy this and a couple times, maybe like so. And also we can enable this fit content button to make sure that we have some vertical space where we can enter this. This is way too narrow, right? So what we can do is we can go to layout for this card description node and set the custom minimum size X value to something like 150, which looks much better. And you can see that by using a center container here, we make sure that the CardMenuUI is centered within this. What we also need to do is to move this to the center of the screen. So if we select the VBox container, what we can do is we can anchor this to the center of the screen, right? So by selecting this anchor preset. Cool. So that's all the setup we need for this within the nodes. And we can actually start implementing the code next. So select this CardTooltipPopup, the root node, click on attach script. CardTooltipPopup.gd is fine. Press create. And before we do the coding part, let's just connect the signal we need, which is in this case under CardTooltipPopup node. And yeah, this is something that also happens sometimes in Godot. Even though the node is selected, we can see nothing here. But if you click on it again, you get back this menu and we can double click on the GUI input event and connect this like so. And what do we need to do here? This class will be pretty simple too. So first of all, what we do is we provide a custom class name called CardTooltipPopup. Then we'll provide a constant for the CardMenuUI scene because we need to instantiate it in code when we show a new card tooltip. We also need two onReady references to our tooltip card and card description nodes. And in the ready callback, first of all, we iterate through all the children of the tooltip card, which is in this case one child, and delete them, right? Because those are just placeholders we use to be able to see how this interface will look like in game. And also I added some testing code here. So what we do is when we run this, we hide the tooltip, we wait for 3 seconds, and I arbitrarily picked one card and show the tooltip for it to test this functionality. So in order to do so, we need to implement those two functions, the hide tooltip and the show tooltip. So how the show tooltip function works is it gets a dependency as a parameter, which is a card resource. And that's the card we want to show the tooltip for, right? So what we do is we instantiate a new CardMenuUI scene, add it as a child to the tooltip card center container, set its card property to the card we have, and connect the tooltip requested signal to the hide tooltip in this case. Why do we connect the tooltip request signal to the hide tooltip? It makes no sense, right? Well, it kind of does. Because if you think about it, when we show the tooltip, this whole card tooltip pop-up is already visible, right? This is why we call it show tooltip. So when we click on the card again, that's when we emit this tooltip requested signal, right? When we click on a card. So in this case, when we click on it, we actually want to hide the tooltip because that means that the tooltip is visible now. So clicking on it should hide the tooltip. And what we also do is we update the card description rich text label nodes text to the card's tooltip text based on the resource. And finally, let's not forget to, after setting all this up, actually call the show method on this control node, which will toggle its visibility and it will be visible. Sort of contrary to that, we have the hide tooltip function, which does quite the opposite. First of all, we have a safety check saying that if this card tooltip pop-up is not visible, we can return because we don't need to hide anything. But if it is visible, we can delete the center container's CardMenuUI children and call the hide method on the card tooltip pop-up itself to hide this whole window. And last but not least, we connected the GUI input signal to ourselves. And what we do is we check if the event is a left mouse click. And if it is, we call the hide tooltip. So basically there are two ways to close this tooltip window: by clicking on the whole card tooltip pop-up anywhere in the screen, or explicitly clicking that CardMenuUI we have. Both of those will call this hide tooltip function, so we can close the whole thing. Right, that's all the code we need. We can save this with Control S. And if we scroll up, you can see that we have this code here to test this out. So we don't have to do anything but run this scene, right? Press F6 or click on this button. And if you wait for 3 seconds, that's right, we see this card tooltip pop up. And you can see that I can hover over the card and I can see the description updated with BB code enabled. And let's see if I can close this with clicking on it. So if I click on this, oh, I can't close it. What happened here? Let's see if I can close it by clicking on the text. No, clicking on the card. Okay, so this hides it. What's going on here? Well, we entered the mouse filter rabbit hole again. So if I run the scene again and turn to this debugger panel, you can remember that we have this miscellaneous panel here where we can check the click controls, right? So if I go back to this scene, I should be able to close this by clicking anywhere on the screen, really. But see which control takes this mouse event. Which control node? The background, which is a color rect, right? And it's not the CardTooltipPopup. And it should be the CardTooltipPopup because if I go back to the code, that's where we have this GUI input callback, right? For the CardTooltipPopup itself. So that's the problem. The background is sort of consuming this event. And it's the same with the card description. See, if I click on this, the card description consumes this event. So the only way to close this is to click on something which doesn't consume this event. So to fix this, we go back to 2D view and set the mouse filters properly. So for the card tooltip pop-up, this should be stopped because that's exactly where we want to consume this event. And that's fine. But for the background, we want to ignore this, right? And for color rects, it's set to stop by default. So set this to ignore. And for the card description itself, it should be the same. So if we scroll down here under mouse, change this to ignore. And if we save this and test the scene again, you can see that if I click on it, it hides the tooltip now. So again, I could have done this properly in the first try, but I just kind of wanted to show you that you can always forget about mouse filters and you'll wonder why the code doesn't work because the code itself looks fine. And often the culprit with UI is this mouse filter option like here, but everything works fine now. And what we can also do after making sure that it works is go back to the script and scroll back all the way up to our ready callback and delete this code because this was just to test how it works, right? And we made sure that everything works fine now and we can delete this temporary code and save this with Control S. So going back to the CardPile view, we now actually have this tooltip pop-up scene we can use here, right? So what we need to do is we select the CardPile view, click on this instantiate child scene button or press Ctrl+Shift+A and search for CardTooltipPopup.tscn. And you can see that we have this right here, but we don't need to show it by default. So we can click on this eye icon here to toggle the visibility. And also to make sure that we can reach this easily in our code, we can right click this and select access as scene unique name. Cool. So now you can see that we have everything set up. We have the title available, we have our cards container here, we have the button and we have the tooltip pop-up. That's all the elements we need access to or all the nodes. So we can finally code the CardPileView itself. So select CardPileView, the root node, click on attach script, CardPileView.gd is perfectly fine and press create. So this one is a bit of a longer script, but bear with me, it's not that bad. So first of all, we'll provide a custom class name for the CardPileView itself. Then we'll have a constant for our CardMenuUI scene, so we can instantiate those CardMenuUIs based on the CardPile we have. Speaking of CardPile, we'll have an export variable for the CardPile resource we want to display. And we'll also have 4 already variable references to our 4 scene unique nodes we need. One for the title label, one for the grid container, one for the pop-up, and one for the back button. In the ready callback, what we do is we connect the back button's pressed signal to hiding the whole CardPile view. Then we iterate through all the children of our grid container and get rid of all the placeholder CardMenuUIs we have. Namely, we have 24, if you remember, to see how this whole grid looks like. we can delete those, right? Because these are just placeholders. And we can call the card tooltip popups hide tooltip function to make sure it doesn't show. And then again, I provided some testing code here. Again, we wait for 3 seconds, load the warrior starting deck as an example, and call this show current view function with the argument of deck. And we'll see what this does in a second. We also need to override the input callback, and we can do a little neat trick here. So if we pressed escape, which is the UI cancel action by default, we can see if the card tooltip popup is visible or not. Because if it's visible, then we can hide it by pressing ESC, right? So it will close the tooltip popup first. But if it's not visible, we can hide the whole card pile view. That's a pretty nice trick. You'll see it in action in a second. For this show current view function, we'll have 2 parameters. One for the title of this card pile view, which can be deck, discard pile, draw pile, or whatever else we want later on. And we'll also have an optional parameter called randomized, which is a Boolean and it's false by default. Why do we need this? Well, because in Slay the Spire, the draw pile itself by default is shown in a randomized order. Why? Well, because it would be way too helpful if you knew ahead what cards will you draw next turn, right? In order to make your life harder, what they do by default is randomize it. So you won't be sure which of those cards you'll draw. You only know sort of the pool of the cards available for drawing, right? And so it's false by default, but you can override this when you show the draw pile later on. And what we do first is we'll first of all delete all the cards we have currently under the grid because we no longer need them. We want to update the whole thing. We hide the tooltip by default because showing the current view means showing this whole card pile for the first time. So at that time, you couldn't have clicked on any cards because they're not there yet. We also update the title's text based on this parameter we'll have, and also call this update view function we'll define in a second with call deferred, which means that it will be called at the end of the frame. Why do we need this here? Well, because we want to make sure that we delete all the children first, and then after they get deleted, hopefully at the end of the frame, then we can use this call defer to then update the view. So this sort of makes sure that this will be the last thing called. Then we'll have this update view method. And what we do is we do a safety check first to make sure that we have a card pile we want to display. Because if we don't have one, we can return from this function immediately. And then we can create a new array of cards by duplicating the card pile's cards array. Why do we need to duplicate this? Well, because if we want to randomize it, we don't want to randomize it on the resource itself. We want to create a copy of this and randomize that. So what we do is we duplicate it. And if the randomized parameter is true, we'll call the shuffle method on the array to shuffle those cards. And then we can iterate through all the cards and instantiate a CardMenuUI scene for all of them. Add it as a child to our grid container, set the card property to the card we currently have, and connect the tooltip requested signal to our CardTooltipPopups show tooltip method. So when we click on the card, the tooltip will actually show for that card. And finally, let's not forget to call the show method to make sure that the whole card pile view itself gets displayed. And that's all the code we need. So we can save this with Control S. I promised it's not that bad, and I think it's not that bad, right? So if we scroll all the way up, you can see that we have this testing code here, which should, after 3 seconds, show us the warrior starting deck, and it should say deck. And the cards should be in order, right? Because the randomized property is omitted from here. So if we run this scene by F6, it's empty for 3 seconds, but then it switches to this deck, right? And we have our cards here in order. And in theory, we could click on those cards, right? Cool. So we have the tooltip for this. And if I press ESC, I can close this. I can view all the cards. Or if I don't want to press ESC, I can just click. And everything works as intended. And if I press ESC here and press it again, it should hide the whole card pile view. Perfect. Now to make sure that everything works, we can change this show current view function call here and press true as a parameter for the randomized property. And if we run it again, wait 3 seconds, you can see that the cards are in a different order, right? So it shuffled them around, but they still work the same way. Cool. So I think that's all for the CardPileView. We can still test if the back button works, but it should hide it as well. Cool. So everything works as intended for the CardPileView. We can delete this from the ready callback, this sort of testing code here, save the script, and it's ready to go. The next step is to actually hook this up for the draw pile and the discard pile in the battles, and for the whole deck in the run scene. So that's what we'll do next. So we have our CardPileView ready, and we need to hook it up in different places. Let's stop here for a second and think about how we display this CardPileView. What's the interaction going to look like? What we do is we click on a button for the draw pile or the discard pile, and clicking on that button should trigger showing the CardPileView, right? And also sort of connected to that button, we should have an indicator, a number indicator of how many cards are currently in that card pile, right? And it's sort of dynamic because we can have it on the bottom left side or have it on the bottom right side, depending on where that button is on the screen. So we want to have a sort of freedom in how we configure that label connected to this button. And also, if you think about it, we'll have 3 of those buttons. We have a common functionality between them, and we want to reuse that 3 times. And that's again an indicator that it might worth creating this as a scene, so it's easily configurable and we can reuse it, so we don't need to do it over and over again. Don't repeat yourself if you don't have to, right? So we'll create a new scene before hooking this up by clicking on the plus sign, and this will be sort of a button, right? So this time we'll use another node as a root, and we can search for texture button. And how this is different from the usual button we use is, instead of relying on the theme, it has this textures property group, and we can assign different textures to all those different button states. Cool. So we can zoom in and set this texture button however we want to. And first of all, double click this and rename it to something like CardPileOpener or something like that. And what do we need to set here? We can set this ignore texture size property on and set the stretch mode to keep aspect centered. This way, no matter how we set the size for the button, the texture will try to fill it while keeping the aspect ratio. That's perfect. So we can search for the files here, and let's use draw.png as an example. So if I drag this over to the normal state, you can see that we have this little transparent border at both of those sides, and that's perfect because it keeps the aspect ratio. So let's set the size for this. So if we go to layout and transform, you can see that it's 40 by 40 and it's huge. It's like covering half of the screen almost. So let's change this to something like 16 by 16. And I can set the custom minimum size, or I can set the size to 16 by 16. And we don't actually need to set the minimum size because we probably won't use it in a container. But if we end up using it in a container, we can always come back here and set these minimum size properties. That's all the setup we need, really. And the rest is done with code. So let's save this scene with Ctrl S, and CardPileOpener.tscene is fine. Scenes UI folder is fine. Save this. And you can also use custom textures for hovering it, for example. If you want to make your UI a bit more interesting, a bit more interactive, you can use or create a separate sprite for hovering it, maybe add a little border here. I didn't bother doing this for the sake of the tutorial, but if you're making your game, sure, go ahead and make it more juicier. It's always a good thing, right? Cool. So you see that I didn't add a label here. And why is that? We could add a new child label, right? And we can say something like 99. And if I press W, I can move this like so, right? See, the problem with this approach here is that I won't be able to configure this then however I want, right? Because then it will be always at the bottom right side. And if I want to change this, I can't really. You can use editable children for this, but I think it's really a bad practice, and there's a better alternative way to do this. Why don't we just say that this CardPileOpener needs a label, right? That label sort of comes from the outside world, and we can position it however we want to, right? So instead of sort of instantiating a label node here, what we'll do, I just delete this for now. And what we'll do is we'll define a dependency that we need a label node. I don't care how you give me a label node, but I need one so I can update the counter from code. This will make sense in a second when we actually create the script for this. So select the CardPileOpener, attach new script. CardPileOpener.gd is fine, but instead of no default, we can use object empty. And the code is super simple. So we'll have a class name called CardPileOpener, and we'll also have two export variables. One for this counter label, which comes from the outside world, and one for the card pile we actually want to open when we click on this button. And this will have a setter function attached to it. And in this setter function, we'll set the card pile property to this new value. And if the card pile size changed signal is not connected to our function yet, then we connect it and also call it once with the size of the array that current card pile has. So what this callback function does is it gets an integer value and set those outside counter labels text property to the amount of cards we have here. And really that's all the code we need here. We don't actually want to connect the pressed signal here. Why? Let's save this and go back to 2D view so I can show you. So the CardPileOpener itself doesn't really have access to the information where it's going to be used, right? So think about it like this. This is a tool. This is a utility. It has the card pile attached to it from somewhere, and it has that counter attached to it from somewhere, right? So we need to sort of orchestrate this and use this button somewhere else. Think about the battle scene for a second. This is actually where we're going to use it first, so why don't we just go ahead and open it. So press Ctrl-Shift-O, search for battle, and see we have all these nodes here, right? All these nodes. We did a lot of work on this battle scene already. So what we'll do here is we start sort of rebuilding this UI a bit. We'll add two new CardPileOpener buttons, which we provided just now, under the CardMenuUI and under the Enter button, right? We also instantiate two different CardPileViews, which we also created earlier, right? So we'll have 4 new instances. We'll have 2 new card piles for the discard and the draw, and we'll also have 2 CardPileOpener buttons for the draw pile and the discard pile respectively. And what's cool about this is we have all the setup we need to sort of connect those together. So if I click on the draw pile button, it will show the draw card pile view. But whose responsibility of doing this is? It's not the card pile views, neither the card pile openers. Those are just tools. We orchestrate this here. We'll use either the battle or the battle UI to sort of form those connections, right? Connect the button's press signal to the CardPileView's show function. And by doing this, gluing those pieces together, we can reuse them wherever we want to. I hope this makes sense, and you'll probably understand it anyway when we do it, but I sort of wanted to stop for a second and explain my reasoning before actually doing it. Okay, so that's enough talking about it. Let's do the thing, right? So first of all, select the CardMenuUI and go into move mode by pressing W and sort of move it upwards. So we'll have some room for the button itself. And we can do the same for the Enter button, right? So I press and hold Shift and drag the mouse up like so. So we have some space under. Go back to select mode by pressing Q or clicking those buttons. And under the battle UI, we can instantiate those buttons first. So click on the instantiate child scene and search for CardPileOpener, right? That's how we call those. Double click and rename this to draw pile button and anchor it to the bottom left of the screen. Go into move mode and sort of position however you like. We can zoom in a bit maybe. Yeah, that looks fine, I think. You can see that we have no label, right, to display the numbers. And that's why we did it with an export variable, because what we can do here is we can just, with this draw pile button selected, add a new child node actually, a label. And we can set that label something like 99, rename this to counter, and we can make sure that it's not that big, right? So go to layout, transform and set the size, reset it with this little arrow here. And we can move it around however we would like to. So I press W again, and this time I want to display the number at the bottom right. So I just move it here, And what we do is we select the draw pile button, click on this assign here for the counter, and we select the label which is under the draw pile button. And that's what I meant by getting this label from the outside world. We just provide an export variable and we can have a reference to this, like so. It's really cool because it gives us the flexibility to position and even format or design this label however we want to. Cool. So we kind of want to do the same thing for the discard pile. And what we can do is we can zoom out a bit, press Ctrl D to duplicate this, rename this to discard pile button, and anchor this to the bottom right of the screen. Zoom in again, press W and move this to somewhere around here. If you're a perfectionist and you are bothered by things like these are not being level with each other, which I am, what you can do is you can go to layout, transform, and see the Y positions, right? So it's 122. And for this one, it's 124. So I make sure that they are leveled by setting this to 124 as well. And we can select this other counter, zoom in, go into move mode by pressing W, and we can just move it around to the left side now. See how cool is that? We don't have to use editable children or don't have to provide this label in the CardPileOpener itself. We just provide a dependency and we can move it around however we like. And that makes it pretty flexible and reusable. So it's a cool little trick. What we can't forget, however, is that we need to set this counter, right? Because now it's set to the draw pile buttons counter, not its own. So we need to make sure to click on this and select this one under the discard pile button. This is really important because when we duplicate it, you might forget this and you get some weird unexpected behavior. So don't forget to set this to the proper counter. That's it for the draw pile and the discard pile button. What we can also do is we can make sure that we can access this from wherever. So select those and access them as scene unique names to make sure that no matter where they are in the hierarchy, we can get a reference to them. Cool. So the rest we'll do from code. Yeah, and also let's not forget to change the texture for the discard pile button, right? Because that shouldn't display this image. But thankfully, this is a texture button, so we can just expand these textures, group here, and search for discard.png. And boom, we change this. Cool. So now they are truly finished or prepared. And we also need to create 2 new CardPile views where we can actually display those discarded or drawn cards. And to do so, we can sort of collapse this battle UI for now. And again, we might create a separate canvas layer for this. It might be a good idea, as you'll see later on. So select this battle node, the root node, click on the plus sign and search for canvas layer. Add a new canvas layer, rename this to CardPileViews, and instantiate with Ctrl-Shift-A or this little icon here to CardPileView scenes. You can press Ctrl-D to duplicate, and we can rename this to DrawPileView and DiscardPileView respectively. And we can hide them by default because we don't need to display them. Select both of those, and here it's really useful again to access them as scene unique names. Right, for the CardPileViews layer itself, stop for a second and think about which layer we want to put this on. So the whole UI we have is on layer 1. This red flash effect is on layer 2, and the battle over layer is on layer 2. We don't ever want to display the red flash on top of the CardPile views, right? So we can increment this layer by 1 and put it on layer 3 to make sure that it's displayed on top of everything else. Cool. So we can save this, and that's all the setup we need from the editor side. Now we need to actually make this work with script. Before actually starting the code, however, we need to take a step back and think about the flow of the battle a bit. Because if you remember, we sort of initialized the draw pile and the discard pile at the start of the battle. And by initialize, I mean create new card piles actually, right? And we do this on a per battle basis. So if you think about it, we can only assign those card piles to the button and the CardPileView instances after we've done with this initialization or creating those new card piles. So we need to find those places in code and implement these changes afterwards, right? So let's click on the battle script and take a look at what we're doing here. So if we scroll down a bit, we have this start battle function, right? This is a good place to look, sort of, at first. And if we look at the start battle function itself, we set the getRepos to false, play the music, reset the enemy actions, and call the player handler start battle. None of this is actually initializing the draw pile and the discard pile, but if we have to guess, probably the player handler is where it gets done, right? So if I control click on this function here, we open the player handler and you can see that the player handler's start battle function is where the magic happens, because the draw pile becomes the duplicate of the current deck and the discard pile becomes a new card pile. Cool. So we can see that after we call this function, we can actually assign these card piles to their buttons and their card pile views. Cool. So with that established, if we go back to battle.gd, we need to make sure that we do this thing somewhere around here, right? So we can write something like to do initialize card pile and button stuff. We don't really actually want to do this here in the battle itself because these are all UI related stuff, right? So we don't want this to be the responsibility of the battle, but rather it could be the responsibility of the battle UI. So what we do here is we press Ctrl-Alt-O and search for battleuI.gd. So what do we need to change here? First of all, we'll have 4 new references as onReady variables, the 2 buttons and the 2 card pile views. Then in the ready callback, we need to connect the press signal to those buttons finally. And if you remember, this is what I said before, that we don't need to do this in the CardPileOpener scene itself because it doesn't really care about how it's used, right? It just provides the functionality. So what we do instead is we connect the press signal here and form the necessary connections. Meaning, when we click on the draw pile button, we call the draw pile views show current view function and binding those 2 arguments, right? It should say draw pile and it should be randomized. For the discard pile button, we do kind of the same thing. We call the discard pile views show current view function and binding the discard pile as a title here. And we don't need it to be randomized here, so we can just omit the second argument. But that's not enough because we need to initialize them. As we said, we need to set those data they need, the card piles themselves. So what we do is we'll create a new method, which we call initialize CardPileUI, and we'll have 4 lines of code here where we set all their card pile properties to the corresponding ones from the character stats, right? And that's all the changes we need for the battle UI itself. All the functionality is there. We can save this with Ctrl-S, but let's not forget that this function is what we were talking about earlier. We need to call this after we've started the battle and the player handler initialized the draw pile and the discard pile. So what we need to do is we need to go back to battle.gd and replace this to-do comment here with battleuI.initialize CardPileUI, right? And that's all the setup we need actually. So we can save this with Ctrl-S and test if it works or not. So how do we test this? Well, we just need to run the battle scene, right? So the battle scene is selected here. I can go run scene or press F6. And if we run the game, you can see it right away. It's no longer 99. Well, the labels are a bit off, but we can fix this in a second. So if I click on the discard pile, it's empty because I haven't discarded anything yet. And I can press escape to close this. And my draw pile should have, 1 defend card, 3 more attack cards, and 2 AoE cards. It's perfect. And I can click on those cards to see what they do. I can press escape once, and if I press it twice, then it closes it. So that's perfect. Let's see what happens if I play some cards. You can see that my discard pile becomes populated, and we have all the cards here. The labels update accordingly, and I can end my turn here. And if I end my turn, another card gets added there, the attack card, And if I draw my new cards, you can see that the draw pile is almost empty now. And I can keep playing the game just like I have before. Cool. So you can see that I had 8 cards here. And when my draw pile emptied, my cards from my discard pile got reshuffled and all the information is updated accordingly. Pretty cool, huh? Let's just fix those labels real quick because it really bothers me that they are not at the right place. And it's a pretty simple fix, right? Just go back to 2D view and under Better UI, we can expand those buttons and change the counters. So maybe we can see it better if we just use one number. So the problem wasn't the positioning actually. You can see that if I only have one number here, we just need to set the horizontal alignment to center. And it kind of fixes it, or we can even set it to the right. Whichever looks better, I think. Yeah, I think that looks fine. But you can do it however you like to. Maybe we can leave it at left actually and move it a bit by going to move mode with W. I don't know which one looks better. Maybe this one, or maybe centering it. I don't know. It's kind of weird that it jumps, I think. Maybe I'll leave it at center for now. I leave it at center for now. Okay, so we can do the same with the other one. If we move over, we can do something like centering it. Yeah. I think that looks, yeah, that looks fine. Okay. So I'll leave it at this centered position for now, but you can format it however you want to. That's the cool thing about this, right? We can change it to our liking. For now, that will do. Okay, so we finally hooked up this CardPileView stuff in the battle scene, but we still have to do it for the run itself. So that's what we're going to do last. If you like my content, please consider checking out my Ko-fi page where you can donate one time or become a member and get early access to all my content and videos. Our final task in the video is to set up the deck view in the run scene. To do so, let's press Ctrl-Shift-O and search for run.tscn. So now that's all we have here. And for this one, we actually need to create that top bar we had in the demo because it should be on the top right corner of the screen. So first of all, click on these debug buttons and set the alignment to center so we can see the top bar when we actually create it. And let's create the top bar. So select the run node, the root node, click on the plus sign or press Ctrl-A and add a new canvas layer. We can collapse these debug buttons for now. Double click and rename this canvas layer to top bar. And for the layer, we'll put it on layer 3. So it will be on top of everything else. And the first child we add with this plus sign or Ctrl-A is a color rect, which we'll call background. And for the anchoring, we can use top wide here, which is the whole width of the screen. And in the layout, we can set the custom minimum size to something like 18. Right, that works. And for the color itself, we can use again a black, which is semi-transparent. I go for 50% here, which is 128. That looks all right. And we can add a new one, a new child. And this time we'll add an HBox container because this whole top bar will have our health, the gold we have, the relics later on. So there will be a bunch of stuff here. But for now, it's just the button itself. And for the anchoring, we'll use the same. We'll use top wide. And we'll set the custom minimum Y to 18. And we can double click and rename this to bar items or something like that. And add 2 new children to this. So the first one will be just a placeholder control node, which we can call placeholder. And then we'll instantiate a new CardPileOpener button here. And you can see that we have this minimum problem size we had earlier. I said that we might need to set the custom minimum size in order for this to work. And I was right. But it's not a problem because it's just one node. So we can set it here to 16 by 16. Cool. Now we have this, right? Okay. And what we can do is we can double click and rename this to deck button. and also access it as a scene unique name so we can have access to it in code. And why do we need this placeholder control node, by the way? It does nothing, right? But if we go to layout and container sizing, we can fill the space in the horizontal axis, and it's already looking much better, right? Because we want this deck button to be at the rightmost side of the screen. Cool. So for the deck button itself, if we go back to it, we need to set the texture. So we can search for deck.png, change this, right? It looks better. And let's not forget that we need to assign an outside label to this. So with the deck button selected, we add a new child, this time a label. And again, we can use this 99 as a reference, center this, go to layout, transform and reset it so it's not that big. And we can go into move mode by pressing W and move it to our liking. I like it there. And we can see how it looks like when it's just one digit, but yeah, I think that's fine. And we can double click and rename this to counter again. And here, let's not forget to assign it, right? Okay, go back to select mode by pressing Q. And we have our deck button here. The top bar is basically ready to go, but we still need the CardPileView itself, right? So if we select the top bar again and click on the instantiate child scene button, we can search for CardPileView. Perfect. And we can call this deck view and also access this as a scene unique name. So we can set it from code and toggle its visibility off so we don't see it by default. Right, that's all the setup we need from the editor side. Now we need to change the run script to make sure that these changes actually work. So click on this script icon here. Okay, so before jumping into the new code itself, let's talk about responsibilities again. Because here you could argue that all this top bar stuff we could do in a separate script for the top bar itself, right? So why does the run handle this? Well, I mean, yeah. So here, that's a really minor decision that doesn't really affect your game or your code in any way because we only have this top bar here once, right? So we could certainly abstract it out and create a top bar.gd script and handle all the top bar stuff there. But I don't think it's necessary because there's not a lot going on for the top bar code when I look at it as a whole when we finish the project, right? So it's the other side of the argument actually compared to the battle, because in the battle we had the sort of same dilemma between using the battle.gd to handle the UI stuff or create a new script called battleui.gd. And there we went with the solution of actually handling the UI separately, right? And here we could do the same, but top bar itself is so simple even compared to the battle UI that I don't think it's necessary. It's like 15 lines of code in total or something like that when we look at the end project. So certainly we could do a separate class, but then we need to start injecting dependencies from here to that top bar script, and it becomes longer for no real gain, I think. The downside of doing it here is that our run class or script will be a bit longer, but I mean 15 or 20 lines, it's not that much. But if you think that it belongs in a different script, go ahead and do it in a different script. It's not that difficult to abstract it out. Here, I just wanted to show you the other side of the coin, basically. So, enough talk. What do we need to do here? First of all, two new onReady variables, one for the deck button, the CardPileOpener, and one for the deck view, which is the CardPileView. Then what we need to do is when we start a new run, we'll call this setUpTopBar function. And remember, again, we can only call this and set up all the stuff we need after we have our deck ready. But if you take a look at where we call this start run function, it's right there, right after we create a new instance of the picked character. And that's perfect because creating a new instance means duplicating the starting deck. So we'll actually have a deck we can display then. So we'll start a new run, and after starting a new run, we can set up the top bar. And we actually need to implement this method, right? So what we do in this setUpTopBar method is really simple. We'll set the deck button's CardPile property to the character's deck and do the same for the deck view and connect the deck button's pressed signal to actually showing the deck in the deck view. And that's all the changes we need. So if we press Ctrl S to save this, we can test it. So if we have the run scene selected now and run the current scene, you can see that I get an error message. Why is that? Well, because it says that non-existent function create instance on base nil, which means that this is null, right? What's the problem here? Well, I didn't start the run from this character selector screen and the picked character is null. But I don't actually need to start it from the character selector screen. What I need to make sure of is if we go back to 2D view and search for our run startup resource, which we created in the previous video, I can double click this and you can see that the picked character is indeed empty, right? So if we leave this empty, then I can start the game from the run scene to test it because it tries to create an instance from a non-existent character. But for testing purposes, it seems tedious to always start it from the character selector, right? Why would I want to do that? So what we can do instead is search for the warrior characters resource and just sort of drag and drop it as the picked character. And that's the cool thing about having this run startup resource in the file system, because we can sort of emulate that we pick the warrior, right? And now if I run this again, we have our run here and you can see that we have our deck button and it updated the label accordingly, saying that we have 10 cards in the deck, which is correct. And if I click on this, you can see that we have our starting deck here, and this is not randomized and it shouldn't be, right? Because these are in order. I can click on those, press ESC, everything works just as it did before. One thing I wanted to show you is sort of tying it all together. If we go to the battle scene, you can see that we have our top bar here too, right? So we can view our deck, but we can also view our draw pile, right? So I can click on these and everything works as intended, except for when I try to click this back button. What the hell happened here? That's really weird, right? So I can click on the back button here, but if I move it there, it's sort of like clicking the button behind it. How did that happen? Well, if we take a look at the remote scene tree here, you can see that under the run, we have our top bar here with the bar items and all, and we have our current view here, which has the battle. So the problem is we have our card pile views here on layer 3, right? Which is perfect. It renders on top of everything else. But what's the problem here is that if we take a look at the top bar itself, which is lower in the hierarchy, it's on layer 3 too. So that's a big problem because these two canvas layers are on the same layer. And technically speaking, I can still interact with this because they are on the same layer. So that's one little minor bug we need to fix, but it's a pretty simple fix actually. If we go back to the battle scene and take a look at this card pile views layer, all we need to do is increment this layer by 1 to make sure that it's on top of the top bar even, right? So when we make sure that it's a layer up, even over the top bar, it means that we pick up this draw pile views click event sooner than clicking on the deck, which is behind. So if we run the game again, just by adjusting this to layer 4, we can still use this, right? We can still click on this. We can click on the back button. And here it's not a problem, right? I can't click on this button to do anything. But if we go to battle, click on this, it still works. I can still use ESC. I can click on the back button. But if I click on my draw pile here, it seems the same, right? And you can already see that it no longer deactivates this button. If I hover over this and no matter how many times I click, I can't open this deck under the draw pile. So we sort of fixed that bug because this is on layer 4, so all the input events are picked by this layer here. Perfect. So we fixed that little bug. And that's all for this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.